We're joined now for a deep dive into what's happening in Eastern Europe this week by Unheard newsroom editor James Billow. James, it seems to me this story has gotten almost buried, dare I say, in a crazy presidential news cycle here in the United States. The situation in the Middle East seems also to be sucking up a lot of the oxygen, but huge developments out of Eastern Europe. Tell us what's going on.
We have seen a lot of war fatigue with Ukraine for the past year or so as this war of attrition grinds on in the eastern part of the country. But this raid in Kursk occurred on August 6th, and it is the largest attack to have occurred on Russian soil since World War II. So it's a hugely significant attack. And as of today, Ukrainian forces now claim to control nearly 400 square miles of Russian territory, as well as 28 settlements. And there have been all these clips surfacing of Russian soldiers surrendering and an extremely unhappy Russian president because it resulted in 130,000 civilian evacuations. It's pretty clear that Putin was caught by surprise here. And so here's a little exchange he had with the Kursk governor.
Глубина проникновения на территорию Курской области составляет 12 километров. Ширина по фронту 40 километров.
Послушайте, Алексей Борисович, это военное ведомство вам доложит, какая там ширина и глубина. Вы расскажите нам про социально-экономическую ситуацию.
So Putin is a little bit rattled, and he claimed that the West is fighting Russia with the hands of Ukraine, again, really emphasizing this idea that this is a Western-led proxy battle, and that tense exchange with the Kursk governor is further testament to that. What makes this raid different from the previous incursions is that this is a proper offensive. It's not like a light skirmish like Belgorod. Ukraine is using 3 brigades, so this is a proper offensive that Ukraine has taken full ownership of.
Well, James, can I actually just pause on that point? Because we started this segment talking about the news cycle and how because the war has become one of attrition, it's sort of gotten almost buried in the news cycle as attention has turned to the Middle East, but it's hugely consequential. You just said this is the largest incursion in Russian territory since World War II, some 400 square feet. So you mentioned the battalions as well. What in the last couple of days, and even in the last 24 hours that we've seen, how does that compare to what you described as the light skirmishes that we've seen pop up here and there in this war of attrition? What's different now?
About a year ago, the largest sort of transnational, trans-border attack was the Belgorod raid. But what was different about that raid from this week's raid is that Ukraine was still employing some degree of plausible deniability. They were operating with far-right militia groups operating within Russia. They were empowering Russian mercenaries to basically destabilize Russia from within. What's different here is that there are questions about whether this is a sign that it's the last gasp of the Ukrainian defense because, okay, we're now fighting the war on Russia's terms, they're winning the war of attrition, they have more manpower, their economy is geared towards producing more armor, more equipment, and everything is basically working towards their favor. So this was an attempt to sort of reverse that momentum.
Well, and can I ask you about that? Because the big question in my mind as, just kind of a layman on the military question here is, what are they going to do with that territory? They now have 400 some square miles in Russia. What do you do with it going forward?
Well, this is the problem that has been posed to the Ukrainian leadership. They have explicitly stated today that they do not want to hold on to the territory.
So like as a bargaining chip to get different territory in the Donbass back.
Exactly. But the issue is that it's diverting incredibly valuable resources, manpower and material from areas like Kharkiv, where there's huge fighting still ongoing, towards these parts of Russia where actually the result of the fighting isn't hugely consequential. So this is again reiterating the point that this might be a symbolic victory, a Pyrrhic victory, but either way, it's unlikely to change the course of the whole war. But what's interesting is the degree of Western involvement in this whole process. So we had Senator Lindsey Graham already in Ukraine describing Kursk as this bold, brilliant, and beautiful raid.
Wait, did you say he's already in Ukraine before we play the clip? Is he?
Yes.
He's already in Ukraine?
Of course.
He materialized in Ukraine immediately. He just sort of, all he had to do, it's like the port key in Harry Potter. Like he just grabs onto his golf club and suddenly he's in Kyiv.
He always knows where to be at the right time.
What I think about Kursk, bold, brilliant, beautiful. Keep it up. Putin started this, kick his ass. Bottom line is to the administration, I appreciate your support. Let these people fight.
The question is, how involved were the West in this whole process? Now, the US claims that it wasn't given advance notice of the raid, but it's very hard to imagine that this wasn't done without their tacit approval. We had a report from Politico recently saying that allies did in fact give a greenish light to the operation.
A greenish light?
What they mean by that is that they basically didn't stop it from happening, but were aware of it. That's especially the case when you consider just how deep the ties between NATO and Ukraine now are. This is coming a month after that NATO summit in Washington. So it's impossible to believe that Western allied forces did not know what was going on here.
Yeah, I was just going to say the same thing. I was going to say that is almost impossible to believe. And James, actually, I was reading to see what the Russian propaganda was on this morning. I went to RT International, and they floated this idea that, well, not floated, they heavily suggested that it was Joe Biden stepping down from the Democratic ticket that made it a ripe time for Ukraine to go forward with this incursion into Russian territory, because he's, sort of this figurehead. American foreign policy post-November is up in the air, and they want to almost, and I'm curious what you think about this, they want to almost paint Kamala Harris into a corner and force her to support this, essentially, because she's now at the head of the ticket.
And I would flip that as well and saying that Biden, who is now essentially a lame duck president, he can't achieve much legislatively in Congress. The only way he can make a real difference now in his final few months is on the battlefield, is in these wars in Ukraine, Israel, and even China. So he might be really trying to cement his legacy here by going full Tonto. And that's what's probably the most interesting part of this, is that both the US and German operated vehicles are now on Russian soil. And this is a huge turn. So just think about Germany in particular, which once prided itself on being this, at least rhetorically, quite a realist country in terms of Europe. Just 3 months ago, Chancellor Olaf Scholz had made it a condition that German weapons were not to be used on Russian territory. But then just a few days later, he changed his position to say that actually it could happen and that it was in line with international law. Biden then follows suit and adds a condition that weaponry could strike Russian territory, but it had to be near Kharkiv, where a lot of the fighting is going on. Well, if you look at a map, Kharkiv is 150 miles away from Kursk. So there's clearly some blurring of the lines here going on already.
That is incredibly interesting, because I saw H.R. McMaster reacting to this, who's obviously a military leader here in the United States. He was saying this is sort of, to paraphrase Reagan and to paraphrase McMaster, this is peace through strength in action, that the only way Ukraine was ever going to win this war was by flexing its strength and its military might. And that's what's going to put Putin on his back heel and end everything and fast forward to peace talks or to keep Russia permanently out of the Donbass. On the other hand, there's an incredibly serious argument to be made that when you have German and American weapons and or tanks on Russian soil, and the largest incursion on Russian soil since World War II, now we have two nuclear powers, actually multiple nuclear powers, involved in all of this. Is this lurching towards a Franz Ferdinand moment? And that's something we never know until, months later, basically.
On the nuclear point, the FT came out with a big story today detailing all these secret files about all these nuclear warheads on Russian naval ships geared towards different targets across Europe, which just goes to show the lengths that Russia would be willing to go, and emphasizing this idea of total war. This predates the Ukrainian war. This is from 2008 to 2014. But to your earlier point, I think it's worth reflecting on just how far we've come since the start of the war and even before. Because all those self-declared limits on direct involvement have been systematically dismantled. In 2017, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the US first officially provided Ukraine with lethal weapons. Then came armored vehicles and tanks in 2023. And then came F-16 fighter jets and long-range missiles in 2024. And then came the authorization to use those weapons inside of Russia. So now we're seeing Ukraine using US and German armored vehicles, launching a direct ground invasion in Russia. So we're really seeing a huge expansion of the war over here by the West.
And testing the theory that peace through strength is going to push Putin on his heel rather than actually antagonize him further. And you're always testing that out. It's always a matter of probability. But every indication that we have had from Vladimir Putin over the last 10 years is that he sees this territory, Crimea and the Donbass, as legitimately Russian, and he sees his mission as to, I won't go so far as to say, reassemble the Russian Empire, but I do think he really believes, it's not just what I think. I think everybody at this point thinks it. And you can't really have it both ways, as some neoconservatives try to, that Putin, on the one hand, wants to reassemble the Russian Empire, and on the other hand, he's just going to run with his tail between his legs as soon as you go into his territory. I think he is very serious about putting Ukraine back into Russian territory, at least the Donbass. So testing this seems really risky, and it's just, far be it from me to, I don't want to control our military, James, but I'm not sure that I trust the people who are controlling this situation right now either. James Billow, Unheard Newsroom editor, that was so helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, if you enjoyed watching this clip, make sure to subscribe, turn those notifications on YouTube, leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. We're here every week, twice a week, with fresh clips coming out just about every day. We appreciate it so much. Make sure to subscribe.